8 and continues into the wee hours, slowly and carefully at first, and then in an insistent torrent. I'd never before realized how often and with what enthusiasm well-intentioned people bandy about the phrase, "you should." Who doesn't hate that directive, really? It's so smug, so certain, so relentless in its implication that there is a magic bullet for whatever ails you, if only you'll do as someone else suggests. In the wake of any sort of public trauma or grief, you'll encounter plenty of unknowns and at least one certainty. The advice givers will come out in full force. You should talk about it. You should forget about it. You need therapy. You need God. You should blame God. Are you taking enough bubble baths? I was 25 years old when I was kidnapped and raped. I had the good fortune, if it can be called that, of being attacked near the end of November. This meant that once I had dealt with the preliminaries required of a victim who has decided to press charges against her assailant, vacating the home that had become a crime scene, submitting to police and FBI interviews, viewing a lineup of suspects, meeting with the U.S. attorney assigned to my case, I could return home to our family home in the suburbs of Chicago, taking time off during a month when I would not be missed at my recently secured dream job, working for a Washington, D.C. lobbying and communications firm. Back in Wheaton, Illinois, surrounded by friends and family who were aware of what I had gone through, a euphemism for rape that people seem to find comforting, I was deluged with opinions on what should happen next, and far more troublingly, what was going to happen next. What was going to happen, it became clear as I listened to the well-intentioned around me, wasn't good. I had suffered a traumatic experience, and I would now need a lot of professional help. A support group, a rape crisis center, and a regimen of talk therapy for starters. There was much discussion about how it might be a good idea for me to quit my job and come back to the Midwest, since my work was so stressful, even without all that you have to deal with now. And of course, it was presumed that you won't want to return to that city. Suddenly, Washington, D.C., like the rape itself, could be referred to only euphemistically. An alternative to coming back to Chicago was suggested rather hopefully. Perhaps I might move to New Haven, where my long-term boyfriend was in graduate school. Surely marriage was on the horizon, and wouldn't a campus far away from Washington be a good place to heal? There seemed to be consensus, and it was this. What had happened to me was awful. Awful in a way that was not ordinary. So I was going to be screwed up for a long, long time. And if I didn't make recovery the focus of my life during the months ahead, I was going to be screwed up even longer. The truth is that at the time, I more or less believed this grim prognosis. During the first weeks after my assault, I was shocked and overwhelmed, tired all the time but never able to rest. I acclimated to a new sort of fear. The fear that one feels after a violence you've only seen in films has made its way into your life. The unthinkable had happened, which meant the unthinkable might happen again. At night, I would dream about the attack, waking with a start or scream. For a blissful moment, I would feel the relief that came with knowing that it was all just a nightmare. But then I would realize it wasn't a bad dream, it was a memory. The kind of memory I might never be able to erase. My grandmother arrived the week before Christmas, armed with Marshall Field's shopping bags full of gifts and the tins of the foods we most associated with her. Crybaby cookies for my father, fluffy tapioca pudding for my siblings and me, and fresh oysters from her butcher, we must support the local businesses, for our traditional Christmas Eve stew. Grammy wasn't a cook or a baker. She made it clear that she had too busy a life to spend much time in the kitchen. But when she chose to make something, she did it lovingly and well. All my life, my grandmother and I had been extraordinarily close. She was widowed, or single, as my sister and I preferred to call her. She visited us so often that she was like a sixth member of our nuclear family, sleeping in the twin bed in my childhood room and talking to me late into the night about the life she had lived and was still living, and all that was in store for me. As a young girl, I often stayed at her home on the North Shore of Chicago, spending summers immersed in her life of books and piano playing and best girlfriends, as she called the community of women we joined for picnics at Ravinia, the summer home of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Grammy believed in many things: good posture, 3 hours of piano practice a day, the evils of big box stores, the restorative power of a good book. I suspect that she wanted me to believe in these things too, but she would have never told me so. She considered beginning a sentence with, "I think you should," both bad strategy and bad form. Instead, she dispensed wisdom so effortlessly and unobtrusively that you were never certain she believed it to be wisdom at all. She presented her suggestions the way a health-conscious mother sneaks pureed spinach into the brownie recipe, in small doses, undetectable, usually in the company of a delicious story. Late in the afternoon on the day before Christmas Eve, I sat listlessly wrapping gifts at our kitchen table. I can't recall if it was dark out yet, but in my memory, the sun never shone during the Christmas of 1990, and in an odd way, I didn't want it to. The frenetic energy of the holidays had temporarily vacated our home. Everyone else was last-minute shopping, so only my grandmother and our ancient black and white Cocker Spaniel, Miss Kelly, remained in the house. Grammy came into the kitchen, made us each a cup of tea, and sat down beside me, putting a plate of crybabies between us. One of the things I loved best about my grandmother was her stillness. She was undistractable when she turned her attention to you. Though the term was not yet in vogue, she would have found multitasking hopelessly rude. So I wrapped presents as we listened to Kelly's old dog snoring, while the snow fell heavily and silently outside. Eventually, Grammy placed her teacup gently in its saucer, sat up a bit straighter, and clasped her hands together. Even today, I can still see her fingers, which worried a bit before they came together, as if in prayer. She then leaned forward and said softly but very firmly, "Isn't it wonderful, my darling, that you have your work to get back to?" I knew in that moment that she was there with me, but also back in time, thinking of her own darkest chapter. Almost a half-century earlier, she had helplessly watched as the husband she adored wasted away from cancer, making her an impossibly young widow. Her love for the grandfather I'd never known always seemed outsized and idealized to me. I don't think she ever stopped mourning him. But when she spoke of the year that followed his death, she didn't talk about the grief, but instead about the getting on. When I would ask Grammy about losing her husband, she would always say that returning to her work as a music teacher and concert pianist had been her salvation, an enforced respite from the mourning, a reason to get out of bed when she was having one of her down days. She had loved her life before my grandfather's death, and she refused to fall out of love with it afterward. She knew that a retreat from work or life might be the beginning of a collapse, that if she gave up on any one aspect of her world, its entire architecture might come crashing down, never to be rebuilt. So she chose to move forward. She didn't say any of this as we sat, looking at each other across the kitchen table. She was too careful, too self-abnegating to compare her grief from years earlier to what I was experiencing as the victim of a violent crime. She wasn't there to talk about her past. She was there to gently remind me of all of the reasons I had to move forward. "Aren't we lucky?" she would often say, finishing her sentence with the thought of some way in which we were fortunate. It might be the scent of lilacs wafting in from her backyard in spring, or the fact that she lived close enough to Lake Michigan to walk to Tower Beach, or the awfully good dogs our family had owned over the years. Gratitude defined her far more than grief did. She believed that in life, the bad things were inevitable, and that sometimes the best way to get back to the good was to allow the machinery of life and work to carry you there. I went back to my job in Washington 2 weeks later. During those early days, putting a public face on my private angst took some effort. It was a performance that started with a script. I imagined a woman who had lived through violence but emerged triumphant, and I pretended to be her. I didn't always succeed. During those first 6 months, I felt tired and overwhelmed, ineffectual at work and depressed in life. But I showed up. In a sense, I existed in two worlds. There was my private life, where, to a very small community of people I trusted, I unleashed my fear, hurt, and every exhausting detail I could recall about being kidnapped and raped. And then there was my public life, where I tried to live as much as possible, as if such a thing had never happened at all. You were like a Goffman case study back then, my brother Bobby, a social scientist and one of my closest confidants, once said to me. He was alluding to The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, a book by sociologist Irving Goffman. Goffman posits that life is a performance made up of front stage, backstage, and offstage expressions of self. Knowing what it is appropriate to share and when is critical to an emotionally and professionally rewarding life. I'd like to say that I was self-aware enough to have been strategically presenting an ideal self during that first year. But it wasn't strategy that guided me. It was survival. Survival. It's a word I've never much liked. It feels small and limiting, as if barely hanging on could ever be enough. What I'm interested in, and what almost every person I've met who has lived through sexual violence is interested in, is greater than that. We know that our lives will never be the same, but we refuse to believe that they can no longer be good. The essential question for someone who has been a victim of violence is this: how do I get there, to the good part, from here? The answers are as diverse as is the population of those who have lived through sexual violence. Ask survivors what was the most helpful for them, and many will say exactly what you'd expect: leaning on a spouse or partner, turning to a rape crisis center, talking to a pastor or rabbi, keeping a journal. But others will answer that question in ways that are not so obvious and may even seem counterintuitive. I've met men and women who have waxed rhapsodic about the healing powers of taking an improv comedy class, getting a new dog, hot yoga, cold martinis, and bowling. Yes, bowling. I came of age at a time where there was a deep cultural belief in the power of long-term talk therapy as an antidote to the lingering consequences of trauma. And yet more than a few survivors of violence I know have eschewed traditional therapy and engaged in what experts have coined repressive coping. One of these women is my close friend and mentor, Betty Surf Hill. She is beautiful, accomplished, and in possession of the wisdom that comes with nearly 80 years of life. And she believes deeply in selective silence. Betty says that she publicly identifies as a rape survivor because doing so is important for her emotional health and a way to stand in solidarity with other women. But over 50 years after being raped, she still chooses not to speak about the violence that she lived through in any great detail. Going back to the event, stirring the embers of memory, that is just way too painful. My own experience would be to tell a survivor of sexual violence that it gets better over time and heals much like other wounds. Slowly but surely, Betty says. Get up, get dressed, comb your hair, and go out into the street. Tell your friends and family. Treat it like a bad car accident. Get help for the injured part, which includes your dignity and your sense of self-determination. Elisa Roadcup is separated from Betty Surf Hill by 2 generations, but her experience has taught her largely the same thing. During the first few years after I was sexually assaulted, I lived in various states of denial, Elisa says. I used to judge this period harshly, wishing that I had it more together sooner. But now I see that denial was a respite as I started to heal. For Elisa, healing herself has been linked to helping others. Her work with refugee girls through Heshima Kenya, a nonprofit organization in Nairobi, is an expression of that. My experience with sexual violence broke my heart, and then it opened it, Elisa says. It took time and talking to those I trusted, but I was able to integrate my experience as a survivor into the broader narrative of who I was. We are more resilient than we think we are, or than the world believes we can be, says Columbia University researcher George Bonanno. He has spent decades applying scientific methods to the study of grief and trauma, including the trauma of childhood sexual violence. Most people just plain cope well, Bonanno says, noting that both the passage of time and what he calls hardiness, having a purpose in life and believing that you can learn from both good and bad experiences, and seeking support from family and friends, play key roles in rebuilding a life in the wake of trauma. Bonanno gets bonus points for arguing that coping ugly, railing at the incompetent emergency room doctor who performs your sexual assault exam, expressing anger at the family member who responds to your rape by saying that everything happens for a reason, can actually do some very lovely things for the psyche. Bonanno's findings are first world focused, and for all his optimism, his research still points to the fact that many survivors will need professional intervention and support as they work to rebuild their lives. This is just one of the reasons that our national network of rape crisis centers remains so vital. Still, his findings reinforce something I have seen again and again during a decade spent listening to survivors of sexual violence. Resiliency is the rule, not the exception. Recently, I was interviewing a woman who turned the tables on me, asking what most helped me rebuild my life after rape. In response, I talked about my belief in the power of work, my activism on issues affecting women and girls, the benefits of the occasional second glass of Chardonnay, and the healing power of rock and roll. I challenge anyone not to feel better after playing Nirvana's Come As You Are at maximum volume while driving on the George Washington Memorial Parkway. I liked the story that this answer told about me, that in grief I was independent and ambitious, occasionally buzzed, and usually cool. And it was true, as far as it went. But the full truth is more complicated, as full truths usually are. Because during that first year after I was attacked, and for more than a few years after that too, I was transformed by talk. My then partner, Clifton, a man who remains a close friend, was the person in whom I most often confided. Clifton is many things, but more than anything, he is an extraordinary listener. Someone who believes that his silence will create a space for your words. He had driven through the night to be with me in the hospital after I was attacked and stayed with me nearly every day for a month afterward. When I began to talk, slowly at first, and then in a rush of graphic images and brutal details, he was the person I wanted to share my story with. I remember very little about what I said to him during those first 6 months, but I do recall how repetitive I was. My specialty was to talk endlessly about an aspect of my experience, assign meaning to it, and then talk about it all over again, just in case some fresh insight might alter my feelings about what had happened. Has anyone ever been more redundant in grief than I was? My need to talk might arise at any hour. Thankfully, Clifton was a night person. It might be prompted by my hearing in some new way David Bowie's Rock and Roll Suicide, or seeing the film Gorillas in the Mist. I wept over more bad Hallmark commercials than a person with a fine-tuned sense of irony would ever care to admit. And I needed to talk about that too. The merciful thing is that, over time, the hot breath of memory began to cool, and I needed less talk and more life. But the life part, I suspect that it was made possible, at least in part, by all of that talking. I'm certain of very little, but one thing is clear to me. Being truly heard will change your life, which means that someone has to do the listening. In her great novel about the female experience, The House of Mirth, Eden Warden wrote of a silence which is not solitude, but compassion holding its breath. We don't much believe in that type of silence anymore. In our social media-driven world, we are encouraged to endlessly, thoughtlessly express or post or tweet every thought. And certainly, for survivors of sexual violence, speaking out when we're so often told to remain quiet can be a very good thing. But what if the world turns less on what we say and more on what we have the courage to hear? It's a hard thing to listen, truly listen to another person. It often means getting so close to their suffering that it breaks our own hearts. But inside our open, broken hearts, that's where compassion lies. I suspect that the trick with trauma is to remain simultaneously close to it and far from it, keeping our memories near enough to inform our ability to care for others, but far enough away that we can go on living our beautiful, brutal, complicated lives. Thank you.